Welcome. My name is Ethan Porter, and I am on faculty at George Washington University.
Hi, and I'm Katie Baylord, also faculty and co-director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics with Ethan. We're very excited. We've been at IDDP for several years as researchers, but we're very excited to be stepping into our role as co-directors of IDDP, helping it move into its next chapter and at a particularly significant moment in time. We are able to continue our work because of the generous funding and support that we receive from the Knight Foundation. But another big reason that we're able to continue our work is from the strong support that we get from the George Washington University. I would characterize IDDP's work as a place where we try to foster and incubate interdisciplinary research that seeks to better understand and mitigate threats to democracy that arise from digital technology. That is a little tricky to say at the end.
This is going to be a really special event. We have such an esteemed group of panelists. I want to thank them all for coming, for traveling from near and far. I also want to thank Congressman Khanna for sharing his time and his wisdom with us and delivering the keynote address. And I want to give my deepest thanks to President Granberg. In times like this, strong leadership, particularly in higher education, is needed more than ever. And it's a privilege to work at a university where we have such a strong and supportive leader. It's an honor to have you here. And with that said, I'd like you to come to the podium and deliver opening remarks.
Well, thank you so much, and good afternoon and welcome. It is wonderful to see such a packed house today for what is a very, very important conversation about the health of our democracy. I'd like to thank the team in the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics for organizing today's dialogue, and I'd also like to extend a special welcome to Representative Ro Khanna and to all of our distinguished panelists for being a part of this event. When Ethan told me about the event and gave me the opportunity to come, I said, I don't care what I need to do to rearrange my schedule. I've got to see at least part of this. So I'm delighted to be here. And we meet at a moment when the very idea of democracy, government of, by, and for the people, feels newly uncertain. A healthy democracy depends on respect for the rule of law, open debate, compromise, and accountability to the people. And this period has underscored how fragile those values can be. The institutions, the norms, the collaborative spirit that once sustained our democracy has been under unprecedented strain for quite a while now. And it's being tested in novel ways. Misinformation is spreading faster than truth. AI is blurring the boundaries of reality, and civic discourse is coming under attack. But even as we confront these challenges, I know I always try to remember, and I hope we all try to remember, that this is our America. It is shaped by the choices that we make, by the conversations that we have, by the courage we show in defending our shared values. True democracy depends on our participation, our vigilance, and our hope. And now more than ever, we need to explore these issues and develop sound measures to protect the values and norms that underpin our democracy by enhancing public dialogue and trust and mitigating the impact of online harms and misinformation. As the university with the most politically engaged student body in the country, I think we are, that's right, that deserves a round of applause. I think we are incredibly well positioned to advance this conversation. In fact, over the course of the last month, students, our GW students from across the political spectrum have modeled the tenets at the heart of democracy by setting aside political differences, by coming together to support one another, and to foster civic and civil conversations that create community in the face of violence. And in this, they are setting an example for us all. The Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics adds a focus on technology to this important discussion, now entering its 6th year, and I am delighted to say under the new leadership of Katie Baylard and Ethan Porter. IDDP continues to push the boundaries of research at the intersection of technology, media, and civic life. The Institute's scholars bring a critical, evidence-based lens to understanding how digital platforms shape our politics and how manipulation, AI threats, and the abuse of social media are eroding social cohesion and democratic ideals. In the discussion ahead, you're going to hear from an esteemed panel of experts on where we stand across a range of vital democratic indicators. And I invite you to listen, to question, to take stock, not only of where our democracy is, but where each of us can help to lead it next. So to begin the conversation, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the podium the editor of The New Republic, Michael Tomasky. Thank you.
Thank you, President Granberg. I don't work in the academy, but I know enough to know that university presidents have a lot of demands on their time and a lot of people who request that they show up at their events. So it's really a privilege that you have come here and that you're going to spend this much time here. Thank you so much. I can also second what she said about the students here at GW. I had the privilege of teaching a course last spring at the School of Media and Public Affairs. They were great kids and really politically engaged, and I hope to be able to do it again. I want to thank my good friend Ethan Porter here. Ethan and I have known each other for a number of years. We were colleagues. Back when he was a lowly journalist, I always knew he'd trade up, as indeed he has. But Ethan called me 3 or 4 months ago, I think, to say that they had this cooking and he wanted me to participate, and I'm very honored to do so. I'll just say very quickly, we know that we're here in very perilous times, and you know, now the metaphorical wrecking ball of the last 9 months has been joined by a literal wrecking ball. And every morning, it seems something strange, stranger than yesterday, has happened. And it's hard to keep up with and it's hard to make sense of. On the other hand, we did see Saturday that millions of our fellow Americans are, yes, go ahead and applaud, not me, them, and then you, that people aren't giving this up without a fight. So that's good to see. One of the great fighters in the United States Congress is Ro Khanna. Ro represents California's 17th Congressional District, covering parts of the East Bay and the South Bay in the House of Representatives. He was born in Philadelphia. He went to school at the University of Chicago. Then he went back east to serve in the Obama Commerce Department. And then he moved to the West Coast finally in 2011. Is that right? Is that? Pardon me? Wikipedia says 2011. You might have somebody on your staff go correct it. Anyway, he has described himself as a progressive capitalist and an economic patriot. And you all watch the news. You've seen what a presence he has been in the news in these last 9 months. And in this last month or two, particularly with respect to the Jeffrey Epstein story, but more broadly than that. I cover these folks, and I know a number of them. It can be really hard for them to break through and become known. And Congressman Khanna has done that. So enough from me. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Ro Khanna.
Well, what a great turnout. And no free food. Usually, even to get members of Congress, you gotta offer food. Michael Tomasky is wonderful. I was struck at how wonderful he is when he had that clever phrase of a literal wrecking ball and a metaphorical wrecking ball. But he's just a real thinker, a true journalist, and a person of ideas. So when he asked me to do this, of course, I said yes, and I really appreciate it. And what a great panel you have. And President Granberg, thank you for your leadership, for standing up for freedom, for standing up for intellectual inquiry. I can't think of a more important role than leading a university with those values. So appreciate your role. I'm going to keep my remarks short, and I'm not a senator, so I know how to stay with the time limits, because you're here to listen to the panel, 6 to 10 minutes. I will say this, though, and I think it's an important window into why I'm still hopeful. The last time I was on GW campus for a while, I was in one of the GW dorms. I was an intern in 1995 for a person unfortunately passed away, Jack Quinn. He was the chief of staff to Vice President Gore. And I got to do an internship at the White House in 1995. And I remember having a one-bedroom dorm in GW. It was what I could afford. It was a reasonable rate. And my parents from Philadelphia would drive in and help me set up and take me back. And if you had asked back when I was 18 years old in my intern class, we were talking about Seth Magazine or becoming a member of Congress, would a Indian American of Hindu faith, of a middle-class background in Bucks County, whose grandfather was involved in Gandhi's independence movement, become a member of Congress? And the answer would have been probably absolutely not, and certainly in the bottom 10 percentile. One of the reasons I share this is if you're in the group here and thinking of getting involved in politics, don't get intimidated by the person who may be trendy on college campus and have all the friends and have all of the aspirations or the dynasty. This country is still a remarkably open country. And the experience I've seen in this country from when I grew up and had that internship to seeing now 6 Indian Americans in Congress, to seeing an African American, Indian American woman become the major party nominee. And yeah, she didn't win, but she got 48% in Pennsylvania. When I was growing up, you would told me someone could get over 30% in some parts of Pennsylvania, I would have said, you're out of your mind. This country is progressing in spite of ourselves. And what we need to do is figure out how we are on the side of building a cohesive multiracial democracy. People often say, why are we so polarized? We're fighting very deep battles. Post-1965, when my parents came to this country, it was the first time after the Civil Rights Movement that led to the Immigration Reform Act that we said people from any part of the world can come to the United States, not just from Europe. That's when a lot of Indian Americans, African American folks started to come to the United States, and people from different religions, different backgrounds. And if President Obama said, there's a place for Ro Khanna and Kamala Harris in America, Donald Trump said, well, what about people whose culture is being changed? And in a very crude way, he said, Ro's family just got here. They didn't build America. The people who scaled the cliffs of Normandy built America. Every time on Twitter, the biggest comment I get from the MAGA folks is, well, what did your family do to build America? And he said, well, look at the people who fought the revolution. Look at the people who fought in World War II, who built the steel, who built the coal. What happened to you? This is your country. And we're fighting to see how do we build a multiracial democracy? How can we respect the tradition and contributions of those who did build the country and have a place for those who are new, who are contributing to the country? And how do we do this at a time of stark economic inequality, where my district today, $14 trillion, 5 companies, 50-mile radius, over $1 trillion. East of the Mississippi, there isn't a single company at $1 trillion. And while you have all this tech concentration of wealth, and the AI revolution is going to produce even more concentration of wealth, you have rural America hollowed out, factory towns hollowed out, 70% of Americans not believing in the American dream. I fundamentally believe that we need an economic vision, I call it economic patriotism, that figures out how you can have economic independence and success in every community, every family in this country to start to bring us back with a common purpose. We need a Marshall Plan for the United States. And we need, as a party, as a Democratic Party, to be the party that understands the economic future. 2 points, and then I'll end on the point with Lincoln. Donald Trump's basically saying, look, we're going to have a 19th century policy. As I often describe as a 1980s guy with 19th century policies. And if he was a president during the time of Polk, we would have had an illegal Canadian-American war in addition to the illegal Mexican-American war. But no one really believes that the way to build modern wealth, modern economic independence, is to have land grabs or wars with Canada, or that you're going to tariff your way into building that wealth. Our party, the Democratic Party, needs to say we have an actual roadmap for what it's going to take to build economic success in the 21st century, and that we have a plan for every family and every community to do that. I believe if we become the party of the economic future and offer a real roadmap, we're going to be able to win back people who have been disaffected. And when we do that, we will articulate what is the ultimate vision of America. And by this, I mean the vision that Lincoln articulated in 1858. See, Lincoln was struggling with the same issue that Trump is demagoguing. Because back then, there were people like Donald Trump, and they said you couldn't be American if you didn't fight in the Revolutionary War. That literally was the test. Did you have an uncle? Did you have a grandparent who actually fought in the Revolutionary War? And if you didn't, how could you be American? Vance is now basically explicitly making that argument, saying there's a hierarchy of how American you are based on how many of your ancestors went back and fought in this country. Now, I always ask this, and there's always someone, and I think it's incredible. Is there anyone here who can trace their heritage all the way back to the Revolutionary War or the Mayflower? Wonderful. Let's give him a round of applause. And Lincoln's genius was he said about German Americans, and he said about French Americans, he said, it does not matter if you cannot trace your heritage back to the Revolutionary War, and if you do not know someone who fought in the Revolutionary War. If you believe in the Constitution, if you believe in the Declaration of Independence, then there is an electric cord that links your hearts to the hearts of the founders, and you are flesh of the flesh, blood of the blood of those who spilled their blood fighting in the Revolution. We need to be the party of Lincoln. We need to be the nation that articulates what this country is truly means and what makes us exceptional. And I do believe, as a student of American history, that when we articulate that, we will overcome the parochialism, hate, and myopia that Donald Trump represents. So I look forward to the conversation, and I appreciate your having me share a few words.
And that is just a little example of why he's been one of the few to break through the noise in these recent months. Okay, panel, let's go. We have 3 terrific panelists. I think we'll just go in this order. I'll introduce each of you in turn before you make your remarks. Susan Stokes is the Tiffany and Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor and Director of the Chicago Center on Democracy at the University of Chicago. Her research and teaching interests include democratic theory and how democracy functions in developing societies. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. You are not voted onto those 2 things lightly. Sue, where are we today in the United States of America?
I think it might be hard for some of you to see me. So I'm going to stand up. Is this on? We're in a strange place in the United States of America today. I just published a book called The Backsliders about democratic erosion around the world, including the United States. And I travel a lot, and I talk to a lot of people, and I have lots of friends who say to me, you know, what the heck is going on? We don't understand, we're confused, we're uncertain, where are we? And one of the answers that I give them, especially now, is that we live in this strange country in which the government, or a good deal of the government, obviously Congressman Khanna is part of the government, and this doesn't apply to him, but they act as though we're an autocracy. Their instincts are fully autocratic, and they, you know, respond to protests by delegitimizing the protesters. They respond to independent media by saying that the media are the enemies of the people. They respond to you know, any sort of disagreement or actions to the contrary, and want to lash out, repress, beat down, and so forth. And then we have a citizenry who we seem to be living in a democratic country, or at least we go around acting as though we live in a democratic country. We, you know, we plan to vote, we go out and protest, we sort of say our minds, and so we have this kind of misfit, or a kind of tension between the nature of the government and its instincts and behaviors as a regime, and you know, many people in civil society who have a completely different sort of, we have an autocracy and we have a democracy, and we're pushing up against each other, and who wins that is there's a lot at stake in it. Let me just say, I think my job often in kind of trying to answer those questions about uncertainty and where are we and why is this happening, my job is to sort of be the misery loves company person. So we are not alone. It won't come to a surprise to you to hear that the trend toward democratic backsliding or democratic erosion is a worldwide trend. In the last 25 or 30 years, 24 countries around the world have experienced democratic erosion, by which I mean a significant decline in what we call horizontal and vertical accountability. That's, you know, fancy political science talk for the decline in the ability of the people to know what the government is doing and hold it to account in elections and through other mechanisms. And then horizontal accountability is the capacity of co-equal branches of government and independent agencies and watchdogs and the like to also hold governments to account and constrain them and monitor them. When those two things simultaneously decline a lot over a short period of time, we say that those are cases of democratic backsliding. And I could get very nerdy on you and tell you exactly how we measure those things and what kind of data, but I'll just leave it at that for now. So 24 countries, that's a lot of countries. Democratic backsliding comes in two basic ideological flavors: right-wing ethno-nationalism and left populism. The right-wing ethno-nationalism tends to be Europe, older democracies, but not always. India is a case of democratic backsliding led by a right-wing ethno-nationalist government. Left populism has backsliding governments of a left populist kind is more typical in the global South. It's happened in countries in Latin America, including El Salvador, Mexico. El Salvador is not a left populism, but Mexico, Bolivia, Ecuador, a number of other countries. So this is a widespread phenomenon. And I can tell you a little bit about why we are seeing this happen. So two questions that I address in my book. One is, why are we seeing this happen at this point in history? Why do we see cumulatively a big uptick in cases of democratic erosion now? And then a second question is, what makes individual countries more or less at risk of eroding, of having their democracies erode? The short answer to both of those questions has to do with income inequality. Again, I could get very nerdy on you and explain how we go about this, but very solid social science research indicates that the strongest, most robust, most regular kind of factor that separates countries that are more at risk from countries that are less at risk is that the ones that are more at risk are highly unequal. Unequal distribution of income, unequal distribution of wealth. That helps us to understand why this is happening now. Income inequality has risen a great deal over time in today's advanced democracies. Some countries have done a better job than others at using social welfare spending to ameliorate that rising inequality, others less well. And then there's just persistent high levels of income inequality in the global south. Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa remain the most unequal regions of the world. But that income inequality became worse and created more strains after the period of globalization, the opening of economies to international flows of goods and capital, and to some degree peoples, had a kind of a displacing effect in many countries around the world, and increased inequality and increased tensions in the global north, more tensions around immigration. In the global south, more tensions around foreign products and large corporations making investments. So in the global south, that becomes a conflict that's more of a class conflict, more of an economic conflict. In the global north, more of a conflict around identities and around who's an immigrant, who's not an immigrant, who's the real American, who's not, the kinds of things that Congressman Khanna was just talking about. So we're in good company, and income inequality is a key reason why we're seeing a lot of this around the world. Globalization is a key reason why we're seeing it now. I can say a few things about what can be done, and I'll say that acting like we live in a democracy is a very important thing that we can do. I think that democratic rights that are in danger are kind of like muscles. If we don't use them, they're going to atrophy. So this is one of the reasons that it was incredibly important to see 7 million Americans getting out to protest on the weekend. And it's incredibly important to vote. It's incredibly important to support your press. I get the physical paper, the Tribune, delivered to my house every day. I'm a complete troglodyte in that regard. That's very important. Speaking out, trying to resist pressure toward polarization. So political polarization, partisan polarization, is widely recognized as a kind of contributing factor to democratic backsliding. It's also a byproduct of income inequality. Other things being equal, countries and states and places that are more income divided also tend to be more partisan, more polarized in partisan terms. Keep in mind that it is in the interest of backsliding leaders to make us more partisan, to make us think that the key difference between us is our partisan affiliation, and that's a cleavage that overrides any other cleavage. Actually isn't true. We have lots of things, lots of ways in which we're different from one another. These cleavages overlap in reality. And so remembering that you can have things in common with people with whom you disagree on certain kinds of other things is super important. I'll say one more thing about what is to be done. One of the things that is typical of autocratic governments is that they tend to make bad decisions. And the reason they tend to make bad decisions is that they surround themselves with loyalists. If there's a trade-off between competence and loyalty, the autocrat is going to favor loyalty over competence because they don't want to be constrained, and they want to be able to be free to do what they please. Think about Trump 1 versus Trump 2. I like to turn the Marxist adage on its head and say, first time farce, second time tragedy. And what we have, though, is a president who is surrounded by yes men and yes women, for the most part. There are some very intelligent, strategic people involved in the government, for sure. But those kinds of governments make mistakes. They make strategic mistakes all the time, and it's important for the pro-democratic forces to keep an eye on those mistakes and to make use of them. I'll end by just mentioning, people ask me, well, what kinds of mistakes? So very trivial but telling example. You'll remember that there was an election that are held by our neighbors to the north in Canada early in Trump 2. The Liberal candidate was on his way to losing. President Trump started talking about Canada as the 51st state. That boosted the prospects of Mark Carney, the Liberal candidate. And then on election day, President Trump decided to repeat his invitation to Canada to become the 51st state. There didn't seem to be anyone around him who was willing to go up to him and say, not a good idea to talk about that on Canadian election day. And sure enough, Mark Carney won the election and is now the premier of Canada. So that's a trivial example, but there are lots of other ones. And again, this is not just the United States. We see these kinds of autocratic or autocratizing leaders making all kinds of mistakes all the time. And many times those mistakes accumulate to help people oust them from power through elections and through other means. So we're not alone. There are things that can be done. Keep exercising those democratic muscles. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sue. Batting second, Ryan Enos is a political scientist at Harvard University, where he is a professor of government and director of the Center for American Political Studies. He researches at the intersection of politics, psychology, and geography, interesting, to study behavior and attitudes in the United States and other countries. And if you follow the news, and I know you do, you saw Ryan appear quite frequently in the press when the president was throwing his darts at Harvard University, and Ryan emerged as a leader in that battle. So please, Ryan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tom. Is this on? Can we hear it? Sound on? Okay. I have kind of a loud voice, so sometimes I have trouble distinguishing from the microphone. Thank you for having me here. I'm really pleased to be here. As Tom mentioned, my day job is a political scientist, just like Sue, but when I think about the state of democracy in Trump's America, I often draw on personal experience because, as we know, one of the primary targets of Trump's authoritarian attacks have been on Harvard, my employer. So being a target of authoritarian attacks and trying to fend them off, it teaches you things. And I'd like to reflect a little bit on some lessons that I've learned from dealing with for the past year or so. And these lessons, they come in the form of what I describe as three paradoxes that I think teach us about the defense of academic freedom and the state of democracy. And these paradoxes, they speak to why elite institutions such as Harvard, why I think they're especially, on one hand, especially well positioned, but also especially well challenged to be these defenders of democracy. And why perhaps I think it's actually a good idea for us to look beyond elite institutions such as Harvard when we think about what's going to ultimately defend our democracy. So before I get there, let me just give you some background on what went on at Harvard. I'm sure you know what happened generally, but we can talk a little bit about the details. Following the authoritarian playbook that's happened in many countries, Trump, he brazenly and he illegally attacked Harvard because he thought of it as a political opponent. And if you were just casually paying attention, you may not realize just how deep this went. So not only did he illegally cancel federal grants that had been awarded to Harvard, federal contracts had been awarded to Harvard, but by my count, Harvard's subject to at least 10 federal investigations from 4 different federal agencies and the United States Congress. So an administrator at Harvard, he recently claimed to me that Harvard was the most investigated institution in American history. Now, as an empiricist, I'm not sure that's true. I replied to him that there was, of course, things like the mafia that may be able to claim that title, but nevertheless, the damage has reached nearly every corner of our campus. You can see it from the science labs to the cafes. If you read the news, we recently slashed our PhD admissions to almost nothing. Trump's even called cabinet meetings with the express purpose of brainstorming creative ways to punish Harvard. So months ago, as Harvard faced the situation of whether it was going to capitulate to these sort of authoritarian attacks or whether it would stand up in resistance, my colleagues and I, we organized in response to this. And we did things like we wrote op-eds, we circulated petitions, we even held rallies in support of resistance. I spoke at rallies, and if you know me or you know other professors, that may show just how desperate we were to stand up for resistance. I'm glad that got a laugh, because we like to talk, but we don't necessarily like to talk at rallies. And as I said, I'm an empiricist, so I don't really know I can't show what the effect of all of this was, but something worked because Harvard stood up and said no to Trump. It stood up and said no. it famously rejected his demands and it filed a lawsuit to try to block these. And so for political scientists like me, this was actually really awesome because it was what Alexis de Tocqueville, who was the chronicler of American democracy, this is what he said civil society would do, would stand up and say no to the tyrant. And that seemed incredible. And apparently everybody else out there in civil society thought this was really awesome too, because when Harvard stood up to the Trump administration, everybody from former US presidents to NBA coaches was suddenly jumping on this Harvard resistance train. People were really, really excited about it. And you could see this all over the place. It's usually very uncool to say you're into Harvard. Harvard students don't even admit that they go to school there. But Harvard suddenly became one of the most well-liked institutions in the United States by some measures. We actually had survey data on this. And Harvard became an incredibly well-liked institution all of a sudden, which I think actually is one of the many signs that Americans reject authoritarianism and actually appreciate resistance. So when I wasn't writing op-eds, as was mentioned, I was on TV a lot. I mean, so much so that it almost became just like a routine. I'd wake up and I would shave and I'd go do an interview. I'd walk to lunch and there'd be TV cameras kind of out and about trying to catch a stray student or professor for an interview. There were helicopters circling Harvard Yard. It was that kind of environment. And there's a reason, of course, to sort of roll your eyes at all of this. A lot of that has to do with the disproportionate focus on Harvard as a cultural institution. But I'm not sure that sort of media interest is actually such a bad thing, because it shows that we haven't yet normalized these authoritarian attacks. In a fully authoritarian country, when the leader silences one of their critics, people just sort of don't notice. And we're not there yet, and I think that's an important thing. But this intense media interest on Harvard and places like it comes with a cost. And so this brings me to my first paradox, which I'll call the paradox of attention, which is this paradox is that the intense attention on Harvard and other elite institutions, it raises awareness of authoritarianism, which of course is a good thing, but it comes with the opportunity cost of overlooking other places that are facing similar threats, but maybe less high profile. And these threats might ultimately be more damaging. If you to see this, just recognize that as we all know, that the assault on democracy and through the curtailment of academic freedom is of course a lot wider than Harvard. I have colleagues in Florida who are required to post their daily hour-by-hour activities on their office door. This is sort of amusing in a certain respect, because you can think about how like a philosophy professor or somebody might post on that timesheet. But the idea that somebody is monitoring the every move as an academic is chilling to the type of freedom we should have in this society. And this chill is so widespread that it seeps down into the way we communicate and the way we teach. I am one of many colleagues who communicates now on encrypted messaging apps because we're worried that what we say might ultimately be obtained by the government. And I'm not alone in wondering if what I say in the classroom might one day land me before Congress. I could go on about all these things. Professors have been fired for what they've said. They have lost tenure for what they've said. Student protesters have been silenced. And all this chills what is the vital part of expression and scholarship in a free society, but it probably receives disproportionately less attention, perhaps partially because places like Harvard suck all the air out of the room. And when these events go unnoticed, I think it has this when there's no opportunity for public outcry, it serves to normalize a sort of slow smothering of freedom. So let me talk about the second paradox, which I call the paradox of success. So even with this intense media interest, people like me on TV all day, it's become sort of obvious that we don't know how to talk about this moment. And so what we do is we tend to meet it in an entirely inappropriate way. We talk about the authoritarian moves of the Trump administration using the language that he's offered us. There's lots of examples of this. Recently I was on CNN and I was asked for the umpteenth time whether Harvard has an anti-Semitism problem. And I responded to them that they really just had to stop asking that question because they were essentially doing the authoritarians' bidding when they kept coming back to that point over and over again. They never aired that interview. But similarly, we're in the nation's capital and we're under essentially a military occupation, and we continue to talk about these farcical premises of crime and things like that. And we could think of all the examples of that. And I think the reason we do this is because we're in a country that has a long history of taking leaders' actions in good faith. We're accustomed to doing so because in theory our representatives would be punished by the press or by the voters for lying to us. And because of this democratic accountability, we assume that our leaders have actual policy goals that they want to achieve rather than pretext for authoritarianism. And so this is the paradox of success. Our previous democratic success as a country means that our democratic defenses are weakened in the moment when we need them most. And so when people like Trump, when they erode our democracy through these quasi-legal moves, we don't recognize this for what it is. Now, I remember talking to a relative who happened to see me on TV and was confused about why I used the word dictator. She said to me, Donald Trump's not a dictator. He can't be a dictator. He was popularly elected. Now this is wrong, of course, because so many authoritarians have come to office first through popular election, but I think such misconceptions are understandable when we think about the fact that the United States has been a democracy for a quarter of a millennium, and most of us that are alive, we've lived through the most democratic period of its history. But not only that, but I think our self-image as a country is almost entirely caught up in being a democracy. And all this makes it hard for us to recognize what is happening, even when it's happening right here in broad daylight. Similarly, people in leadership positions, like the leaders at Harvard, who are the people who are so important to oppose authoritarian, they became leaders because they were successful at playing a game where the rules of which really no longer apply. Harvard's leaders, they were people that were successful on Wall Street or in Washington, and they became successful at doing things in those places. So they think they can apply the rules of there to bargain their way out of things like authoritarianism. They fail to recognize that a contract with an authoritarian is essentially unenforceable. And I worry that's the same mindset that might ultimately plague, for example, our Democratic leaders in Congress, present company excluded. But I think a lot of our future as a democracy is about recognizing that we don't have that, we can't live with that mindset anymore. So I've got just a few minutes left, and I'll talk about the final paradox, which I think is on a related theme, which I'll call the paradox of prosperity. And this is why maybe we shouldn't look to places like Harvard ultimately. And the paradox is that people that are most able to resist authoritarianism are also perhaps the most vulnerable and least willing to resist it. One reason there's so much hope generated by places like Harvard is because people thought that Harvard, generated by Harvard's resistance, is that people thought that Harvard was the most able to resist it with all of its wealth and prestige. And of course, there's a lot of truth in that. We all hear about how Harvard has a $50-some billion endowment that it can put to work. And in theory, these means that these resources allow Harvard to stand up and oppose things like Donald Trump's attacks. But of course, this wealth also makes it most vulnerable to extortion because it simply has so much that can be extorted. Not only does the wealth make it vulnerable, but prestige makes it vulnerable, and people value prestige. And so I think despite the threats we face to a very core of our American system, there's an urge at elite institutions like Harvard to think that's what is most important is maintaining their place in the current hierarchy. So look, we all know that Donald Trump isn't a true populist. As long as he's on top, he's not interested in disrupting the pillars of wealth and prestige in American society. And this works fine for him because many people at places like Harvard or elite law firms or media companies, they're sadly willing to make some sort of Faustian bargain where they'll trade democracy if they can remain on the top in terms of their power and status. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I think that's ultimately what we see. And I think sadly, what this reveals is how many of us are simply motivated to protect our own positions. And you could even think of this as revealing this old saying that freedom is actually just another word for nothing left to lose. Now, I know that's ending on a little bit of a down note, but what I'd be happy to talk about when I sit down and we have questions and answers is what I think we can all do about this. And I think there is a lot of it, and I would urge that ultimately to think about is that we are in all of this together, and it goes much beyond places like Harvard, and I'm happy to talk more about how that is the case. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Terrific. Now, our third and final speaker. If your television viewing habits are anything like mine, which I suspect they are in many of your cases, you may have started your morning this morning with Eugene Robinson. He was on Morning Joe, as he so often is. He is the longtime Washington Post columnist and editor who retired from the paper earlier this year. He won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2009 for his columns about the 2008 presidential election, and he is, as I mentioned, chief political analyst for MSNBC. And finally, Gene, my friend, I want to mention author of the upcoming book, Freedom Lost, Freedom Won. Freedom Lost, Freedom Won.
Freedom Won.
A
Personal History of America.
and it's out when next year? Next spring or fall?
February 3rd.
February 3rd.
Yep.
From Simon & Schuster. So make sure, I'm sure he'll be gracing the stage at Politics and Prose, so make sure you go see that and buy the book. Eugene Robinson, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. When the book comes out, I'll be happy to come back to GW, so don't worry. Yeah, I left the Washington Post earlier this year after, hesitate to say this, 45 years at the Washington Post. I was hired by Ben Bradley in 1980. And, I left, everybody knows this story, but I left when Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Post now, decided to change the opinion pages where I appeared. In frankly what seemed to be a response to pressure from Donald Trump to make the pages all about personal liberties and free markets. And we used to also be about, human rights and social justice and a lot of other things like that, that most of us who wrote for the page still cared about. And so most of us who wrote for the page have left. So I guess I'm that guy who has nothing left to lose, or certainly not a newspaper left to lose. So I did spend 20 years of my time at the Post as a columnist. And talking head, but I had a whole bunch of jobs at the Post, and I'm just going to speak very briefly about lessons that I think are pertinent for today that I learned in other roles at the Post. So from 1988 to 1992, I was the Post's South America correspondent. Based in Buenos Aires, I covered the entire South American continent. Some of the biggest countries I covered, Argentina, Brazil, and Peru, had only a few years earlier returned to democracy after long periods of military dictatorship, authoritarian rule. And what struck me there, it was a common theme in these countries, was that once the sort of habits and norms and mores of democracy are left, once they're lost, okay, so finally you have another election. Those things don't just immediately reappear. And it can take a long, long time to painstakingly kind of reestablish those habits of democracy that are really essential to a functioning democracy. I saw it all the time in Argentina. I saw it in Brazil. I saw it in Peru. I saw, and one of the things that had been lost and that was most difficult to recover was faith in the justice system. When I was in Argentina, everybody thought everything was rigged. It was all, of course, all the news was fake news, but it was, but everything was rigged, and everything, and it turned out that actually a lot of it was. So while I was in Argentina, for example, the democratically elected president, Carlos Menem, who was from the Peronist party, she was a real character. But there was a point in 1991, I think, his sister-in-law was caught at the international airport either bringing in or taking out like suitcases full of cash, right, that was either was set to be laundered or that had just been laundered. It was all very unclear. But this was like a huge story for a while, and so there was the equivalent of an indictment. She was charged, and then the case went into the courts, and there it just disappeared, and nothing happened for a year, and nothing happened for another year, and finally, very quietly, it all went away. it was dismissed. And no one was surprised because everybody thought everything was fixed. And you know, yes, in this country, the amount of justice you get is proportional to the amount of money you have, right? You can hire, you know, the best lawyers, and you can afford to be sued, and you can afford to wage battle in the courts. But beyond that, we don't think our courts work the way Argentina's courts work, or at least we didn't. But what's the difference between, you know, a suitcase full of cash at the airport and $50,000 in a paper bag that Balthazar Homan apparently was filmed receiving, and nothing happens. So this is incredibly damaging, and so that's one thing that really concerns me. Another job I had at the Post was I was editor of the style section for 6 years, from 1999 to 2005. And the great thing about being editor of the style section is you get to go backstage everywhere. You're invited to all the concerts, all the plays, and you meet everybody and you kind of see behind the scenes. And style also covered arts and culture and the museums, and we covered the Smithsonian. And so I got to go sort of backstage at all the Smithsonians, anywhere I wanted to go, and get these sort of tours of the inner workings and the areas where they're doing scholarship and preparing exhibits for display, and talk to some of the scientists and creators at the Smithsonian, and it was amazing because you know what they were doing was writing our story, writing the story of this country. And, you know, history is such a powerful thing because that's the stories we tell ourselves about us and who we are and who we want to be. So the other thing I'm really worried about is the attempt by the Trump administration essentially to rewrite history, to sanitize history, to reduce African American history, for example, to slavery, which was unfortunate, the Civil War, which solved the whole thing, and Martin Luther King, who gave one speech only, down on the Mall. He had a dream, and what he said was, we should never talk about that whole race thing anymore, right? It's all done. And that's the version of African-American history, my history, that this administration would like to impose. You know, that's one reason. I've been working on this book for a while, but the book that I'm just finishing is 200 years of American history through the prism of my family, which starts with a great-great-grandfather in Charleston, South Carolina, who was sold to a plantation owner in 1829 and was sold again in 1848, and who bought his own freedom in 1851, before the Civil War, who survived the Civil War with his wife and son in Charleston, and then his son was the right age to take advantage of that brief window of Reconstruction when the Union troops were still in the South. And so he was a big success in South Carolina, and he built the house that I grew up in, and he was a hoarder. So he saved all these records. So I had this really interesting and unusual archive that I knew I had to write about someday. So I wrote about that. But really the point of the book and the point of what they do with the Smithsonian and what I think we should all do when we study history is that it's not just African American history, it's American history. American history is all these all the strands of history. Jewish American history is American history. Native American history is American history. And without any of those strands, the America we have today would not be the America we have today. And I am worried that this sort of basic self-evident fact is being sort of papered over and smeared and distorted in a way that is really damaging. And those who control our story, those who control the narrative, have a good chance of controlling where that narrative goes. So I urge you to pay attention to that, and when you can, support not just the politicians, the elected officials who are doing good things, but support cultural institutions as well that are just trying their best to be honest and to be true, and not to succumb to this effort to rewrite our history, rewrite our past. So thank you very much.
We have 25 minutes, and so I'm going to ask a couple questions, and I have a couple of questions from the audience that were pre-submitted. Sorry, gang, no live questions, but I do want audience participation, at least via this way. But I want to ask my first question, picking up on a point that Gene was making about the justice system. The justice system is the final backstop. So let's start with Gene, and then Ryan, and then Sue. And I want to ask about the Supreme Court. And, they're about to decide probably on some of these guard deployment cases. They're about to decide on Humphrey's executioner, which is whether, of course, Trump can fire any agency appointee, commission appointee. And who knows what else might come up in the shadow docket. So, and I know it's on everybody's mind, like, how worried are you about this Supreme Court in this context?
Oh, I'm pretty worried. I'm really worried. This court, even before Donald Trump was, well, not before he was elected, because so many members of this court were appointed by him in the first term. But this court has shown a real desire to sort of to cede enormous power to the executive. Chief Justice Roberts believes in this sort of unitary executive theory, apparently, that the Constitution puts this power into the person of the president, and therefore the president can do apparently, damn near what he pleases. So I think there's some red lines that they won't cross. I think birthright citizenship is probably one of those, just because it is written so clearly in the 14th Amendment. But if any sort of real constraint on President Trump, I wish I could be more hopeful than I am.
One of the funny things about working at Harvard, and it's not a world I originally came from, it's just a world I ended up in, but you end up knowing a lot of people that know people. And so I ask my colleagues at the law school about these Supreme Court justices they know, and they keep assuring me they're very reasonable people, and this will all stop at some point. And I haven't seen evidence for that. So that's what concerns me, is that it's not clear to me where the Supreme Court, I think we have this sort of implicit idea that they will pull back Trump at some point, because right now what seems like they've been doing is essentially letting him operate as an unfettered executive, and not only in terms of things that I think should startle us and frighten us now, in terms of him essentially trampling on things like the power of the purse and other explicitly enumerated powers of Congress. but things that we might see coming down the pike that would sort of redo our governmental structure, like Humphrey's executive, for example. You know, the ability to have independent commissions and things that are independent of the executive seems like a basic function of a modern bureaucratic state. And in many ways, a lot of the sort of things that our government does now and does well are because those are nonpartisan offices. And that's already going out the window, but the fact that that essentially would be, that the ability of Congress to create those sort of commissions would go away is something I think should really frighten us. Now, the explanation I hear occasionally from political scientists, for example, is that the court is trying to essentially not decide on the merits, but is trying to sort of balance things to keep its legitimacy. Now, in some ways, that doesn't sound terrible to me, that we'd want to have a court that wants to think about its constitutional legitimacy, for example. But the more cynical way to look at this, and this is what other people have suggested to me, is that what the court is actually very, very afraid of, and this is the dark side of legitimacy, is having Trump just ignore one of their orders. Because then they think that they've lost any sort of legitimacy they have, and therefore are willing to sort of grant anything they can to show that they are not being overridden by the executive. And if that's the case, essentially, they may keep legitimacy in some sort of sense, but they are essentially sort of a puppet of the executive. Unfortunately, you know, no matter who you talk to, we can't go into their minds, so we don't know what they're thinking. But I think a lot of what we've seen so far would shock us if we would have gone back and thought about this, even knowing who John Roberts was, let's say 5-10 years ago. And so it certainly seems consistent with that type of behavior, where they're sort of essentially willing to cede their authority to the executive ultimately.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I would add just a couple of things. One is that there is almost an open rebellion within the federal judiciary. Below the level of the Supreme Court, there's enormous unhappiness with the heavy use of the shadow docket, the failure of the court to play its role of making law and making clear what precedent is supposed to be. It's also a court that, the Supreme Court, is also, lost enormous amount of legitimacy for various reasons. Some of it is what we call outcome legitimacy. So people don't like the decisions they made, so they don't like the court. But in addition to that, there is the changed method of appointing Supreme Court justices. So it's a version of what has happened in many countries, backsliding countries around the world, where you don't want the court is potentially getting in the way of the executive. So you just change the court. Somehow you change the appointment procedures, or you impose term limits, or you impose retirement ages that are conveniently set at a level that's going to get rid of the folks that are not on your side. And we have that problem in the court, with the court today. So the rule for who gets appointed and who gets to have their nominees decided on was changed, and the McConnell rules are incoherent if you take them at face value. They only make sense if what the real rule is. There's Democratic presidents don't get their nominees decided on if you have a Republican majority in the Senate. So that's a very unstable situation, and it seems to me that one way or another that's going to have to change. I actually want to go back to something that Gene said earlier about his really interesting reflections about the culture of cynicism about institutions in recently redemocratized Latin America. I completely vouch for what he said. It's very accurate, very astute observation. Cynicism about institutions is another, like polarization, is another condition that is very helpful to backsliding leaders, because if polarization basically says, well, you can say to yourself, well, I don't really like what he's doing to the press and the courts and so forth, but God forbid that the other side come to power. And I actually think that's something that normal people like us think, and also leaders and Supreme Court justices say to themselves as well. That's very helpful to these guys. It's also helpful for them to be able to get people to think, well, it doesn't matter that he's, messing with the court, or he's ignoring Congress or what have you. Those are, he tells us all the time that they're corrupt institutions. The people, they're ineffective. The people are partisan, they're out for their own gain and so forth. And that's a prelude to destroying those institutions. And I can tell you very quickly that in Mexico, the president, López Obrador, spent 6 years saying the courts are full of corrupt people who don't care about anything but their own salaries and going out for fancy meals and good wine and so on and so forth. And that was a prelude to changing the nature of the entire federal judiciary so that rather than being appointed in the usual ways that judiciaries are appointed, they are now elected. So, you know, the refrain that you will find familiar every time a case went against him, Lopez Obrador would lament the unelected judges. Well, now they're elected judges. The entire federal judiciary in Mexico is elected. And if you think, well, that sounds like how we do things in a lot of states, in fact, what was predictable was that the ruling party would get its slates of judges through in very low turnout elections in which people are voting for massive lists of candidates whom they know nothing about. And the result at this point is not just an elected judiciary, but a wholly partisan and very incompetent judiciary. So one of the things that we have to fight is this culture of cynicism about institutions. Our institutions are not perfect. They have never worked entirely well. They didn't work for Gene's grandfather,
No,
but
but they're all we got, right?
but they're all we got. And so it's a real mistake to say they don't work very well, therefore what we're seeing doesn't matter. It does matter, and it's different. And you need to fight that. You need to talk to your teenage kids and grandkids to get them to stop thinking that way. I spend a lot of my time that way, so.
I'd like to ask about the opposition party. And Congressman Khanna is gone, so you can speak freely. And let's just start Sue and Ryan and Gene back down the row. You know, what are your observations about how the Democrats how effective they've been as an opposition party?
I think I'm a little less critical of the Democrats than a lot of folks are. I think they were deers with the headlights in their eyes like the rest of us were initially. I think the Democratic Party is an enormous coalition that represents all kinds of interests and values and preferences. So it's hard to be highly unified. We're a geographically, incredibly decentralized country. The Democrats like less authority and more kind of rough and tumble internal processes than maybe Republicans do, more tolerance for it. I think that there's a natural process by which leaderships emerge in the party, and that tends to happen when presidential elections are closer at hand. So I think we're going to see more of that. I do think we have a generational struggle going on within the Democratic Party. It's not going to be news to anybody here. I hope my generation loses that struggle pretty fast. Probably the sooner the better. But we have incredible talent in the Democratic Party, and I think that the Democratic Party is taking its lead in a way from its electorate, which is anxious for a decisive, strong response against authoritarianism. So I have some optimism on it.
Right.
I suppose in a certain respect, I am on the same page as Sue, that I think I'm a little reluctant to be overly critical of them in the sense that I'm not sure what the right way to respond to this moment is. But I would say, so I wouldn't, if the Democratic leaders came to me and asked me what to do, I would have to admit I don't exactly know. But I would say whatever they have done, I don't think has worked. Because Trump has clearly ran through our institutions and our democratic norms in a way that perhaps nobody expected and nobody was able to stop. And I think there are some things we can point to about why that may have happened. One is, as I mentioned in my remarks, I do worry a little bit that Democratic leaders are in this mindset, which again, in many ways makes sense, that Washington is just like the way it's been for the 40 or 50 years that they've been here. And clearly that's not true anymore. And I think part of that problem relates to the gerontocracy that we have that runs the Democratic Party. The thing I think that sets us up for, and I think this is what's interesting as we think going forward in American politics, which, the state of elections, unfortunately, I think in this country, is up for discussion about where we'll be in 2028 when we have a presidential election. That's the kind of situation we're facing. But assuming we have a normal presidential election, like we've had in the past, then I think the Democratic Party is possibly primed for a hostile takeover. in the way that the Republican Party was in 2016. The Republican Party got Donald Trump because a lot of people really didn't like the Republican Party, and somebody just came in and took it over. People tried to do that to the Democratic Party in 2016 and 2020, but it was a more disciplined party, and they closed ranks, for better or worse, and kept the left-wing populist outsiders out. It's hard to see them doing that forever, because since that time, the Democrats have just got more and more unpopular, partially probably because how they've ineffectively responded to Donald Trump. And I think they've opened the door for that. And I think what we will see, one prediction, is that in 2028, I think somebody like Mandami, not him, but he's the kind of canary in a coal mine that shows that large-scale elections can be won by populist outsiders in the Democratic Party. And we might see some sort of almost not, hopefully not with the same impulses, but a Donald Trump type character coming from the left or coming from somewhere else and taking over the Democratic Party in a way that could make them very much change the way they operate in Washington after the next presidential election.
Interesting. Gene?
Basically, I agree with Ryan. I mean, I think that's a distinct possibility. I think the Democratic Party is like the Republican Party in 2015. I mean, I think it is vulnerable to take over by a charismatic, smart outsider who knows what buttons to push and how to push them. And I don't know who that is. And whether that happens, I think, depends as much on personalities as on larger forces. I mean, the right person either emerges or not. This morning on Morning Joe, one of the other guests was, interestingly, was Karine Jean-Pierre, who was, press secretary to Joe Biden, and her book is out. And the title of the book is Independent. And it's basically an announcement of her, exhaustion and a certain measure of anger at the Democratic Party. Although she did say during the program that, well, it's not that she's left the party, but you did call your book Independent, right? So there's kind of a hint. And clearly, there's a lot of anger about, personal anger about how the last election played out, and she was very loyal to Joe Biden and about how he was treated. But then she, then later in the interview, she kind of said a lot of what you just said, and you have to. What Trump was able to do was make a connection to voters and non-voters, not people who didn't regularly vote, and make them feel that he saw them. He understood them, and Democrats are not doing that now. And it's hard to think of anyone except right now, Zoran Mamdani seems to be doing it in New York. We'll see. I think he'll probably win, but I don't think he's the candidate to win a national election. So we'll see.
I'm going to move to our audience questions, and I've chosen 3, one from a student, one from a faculty member, and one from an alumnus. So let's go like Ryan, Jean, Sue with this first question. It's from Ava Hidalgo. She's a student. And she asks, do you think our Constitution and our Congress, our Constitution and Congress, are strong enough to fend off Trump's overreach of power?
Okay, that's a tough question. I like going second because I have time to think about my answer before I get there. So I think that one way I described I was asked this question many times after 2020, for example. And what I said was, in some ways, the Constitution had shown its value. Because, of course, the framers of the Constitution did not think that there would never be a demagogue that would come and try to overthrow the system. In fact, that's what they anticipated. And they set up the mechanisms in order to beat back that sort of demagogue. And it worked. It came really close, but it worked. And so in a certain respect, the United States had been tested and it had beaten that back. Now, it's hard for me to look down the path we're on right now and see that same situation happening. Because as we've learned about constitutions over and over again, and somebody like Sue, who's studied these across the world in places like Latin America, where many of these constitutions were based on the US Constitution, is that, as people say, they're not self-enforcing. It takes people to actually have things like courage and to actually have the motivations and the incentives to make those sort of institutions that were set up actually play the roles they're supposed to play. And unfortunately, I think a lot of those things are failing right now. Now, my hope for this, so I don't know if this is a sign that the Constitution is strong or it's just a sign that it can be made strong, is that I do think American civil society does have the capacity to push back on Donald Trump. My hope for the United States and democracy in the United States was never so much about our constitutional provisions, because like I said, those have been the same as we've seen in lots of places in the world that have ultimately failed. But America has a lot going for it in the sense that we are incredibly rich. Now, that leads to perhaps these paradoxes like I've talked about. But ultimately, I think there's a lot of people that don't want to see everything burned to the ground because they have a lot going for that they want to protect in this country. We're very well educated. And I think there is something to be, which tends to mean people want to defend their rights and things, as there are things we know empirically. And it also, I think, and there's something to be said for this, that Americans do, and this gets tested by things like polarization, very much so, but Americans do have a civic commitment to things like democracy. We're seeing that being tested right now. But ultimately, when that's reflected in our civil institutions, not institutions like Harvard for the reasons I perhaps said, because I think ultimately they might be the ones that fail us, but there's a lot of other institutions, and we're seeing them pop up right now, that have been created around the principle of defending democracy and do not have this sort of ability to be extorted like our rich media institutions and our rich universities and places like that. And they're stocked with people that are ultimately there and have a commitment to democracy in a way that I think ultimately may be the ones that will prop up our Constitution.
Yeah, just briefly, I think the Constitution is plenty strong. I just think, the founders would be, they would be out of their minds today watching the Congress allow a president to usurp their powers, and including their strongest power, the power of the purse. And here's a president who says, I can tariff anybody I want for as long as I want, for as much as I want, well, no, that's a power that Congress has. I can just decide not to spend this money that Congress authorized. I just canceled the Gateway Tunnel between the new train tunnel between New York and New Jersey, he says. This huge, desperately needed project that finally got funded. He says, no, I'm going to cancel it, and it's up to me. I literally don't think there's ever been a Congress that would countenance such a thing. That would, it'd be like, you have got to be kidding. What are you talking about? No, it would be, but this Congress, the Republican majority will not cross Donald Trump. They're politicians. Look, if he suddenly starts looking really weak, then they'll cross it. But as long as he looks strong and he is the most popular person to those Republican members of Congress, to their constituents, then they just roll over. And it's disgraceful, but it's consequential. It's consequential because he keeps gaining ground and accumulating power. Autocrats don't like to give up power that they've accumulated.
You know, if we make our way out of this mess, it's not going to be because of the Constitution. It's going to be because of the people. And I don't just say that to, because that makes us feel good. It's actually what we see. So my book, The Backsliders, Why Leaders Undermine Their Own Democracies, shameless commerce part of the talk. It's a good book. I recommend it. Just out with Princeton Press. What you see there is that, how do these things come to an end? Well, they do come to an end. Some of them do. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil was voted out of office in 2023. Jacob Zuma was removed from office by his own political party, the ANC, but they removed him because his behavior was making them in danger of losing elections. Boris Johnson, who, this was not a case of backsliding, but it was a near miss, was removed from office by the Conservative Party because they were losing by-elections, because his popularity had tanked. So what Jean just said is really important. So the hold that Donald Trump has over the Republican Party, and therefore over the Congress, is contingent on his being extraordinarily, unshakably popular among the base of the Republican Party, but that can change. And he won re-election in 2024 because there were a lot of pretty disengaged voters for whom the message that got through to them was inflation, and to some extent border issues. And keep in mind that George W. Bush, after 9/11, had popularity ratings in the upper 80%, left office under 20% post, Iraq War and the financial crisis. So these things can change, and an unpopular, already an unpopular president, but a Donald Trump who loses a lot of support among the Republican electorate looks very much different from the Donald Trump we see, and that is the way that the Polish, the PIS party was voted out of office as well, and so these things can come to an end. Unfortunately, they also can evolve into full authoritarianism. That's what we've seen in Venezuela. That's what we've seen in Nicaragua. Russia is sort of a case of this, although it never was democratic enough to be considered a case of democratic backsliding. But there was a moment of promise in the mid-90s, and it slid into full authoritarianism, so that also can happen. But I don't think it's the Constitution. The Constitution is a good thing. It's good when the Supreme Court has a kind of reasonable interpretation of the Constitution, which it to guide its decisions. But it isn't the Constitution that's going to save us. It's really us.
Yeah. Can I just toss in one quick thing? You said that sometimes autocrats would make mistakes, and that's what happened in Chile. Augusto Pinochet called a plebiscite for 1988. He had been in power for 15 years, and he called for a vote that would authorize 12 more years of military rule, of his rule, basically. And he was sure it would pass, and he had everything locked down and nailed down. And this is the first big story I covered in Latin America. He lost. He lost. A coalition of parties, ranging from the center-right Christian Democrats to the Almeida socialists, who were to the left of the communists, right? There were like the Almeida socialists, and then the communists, and then the regular socialists. It was like 14 parties together, and they held together and delivered a landslide defeat to Pinochet. On election night, nobody knew whether he would actually accept the result, but another member of the junta, who was the head of the Air Force, came out and preemptively said, "We have lost," and so so that ended the question. But anyhow, they do make mistakes.
Okay, we have 7 minutes left. We have 2 questions, and then I'd like to ask a last question that requires a very short answer. But so if you could just tighten up the answers a little bit here for the next. No, that's okay. But I want to get all these people in here. Dana Iglaitis, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Dana, who is a faculty member, asks. She'd like to hear a couple, or maybe Dana could be either, specific steps that universities and colleges can take to protect free speech in the classroom and on campus?
Okay, you told me to be brief about that, so I'll try. That's going to be a hard one.
Yeah, wait till you hear the next question, and I've asked you to be brief about
So
it.
let me say a couple things briefly. First of all, I think collective action by universities is so crucial. And we've seen this, for example, a lot of universities have shown a lot of courage in rejecting this authoritarian compact, and putting that in quotation marks, that Trump has offered. And I think the more universities can act collectively to say they're putting up their collective defenses and coming to each other's defenses. I've urged Harvard to do this over and over again, to lend its prestige to other universities and say that we are going to, anytime one university is attacked, we consider it an attack on the whole academy. And I think that's crucial. Another thing is universities have, for reasons that perhaps are understandable, but I think in retrospect were a grave mistake, have done a lot to shut down on student protest in the last 2 years. And there is a very clear, at least correlational, relationship between student protests and the defense of democracy. It happens whenever there's student protests, they come to the defense of democracy. And unfortunately, I can tell you, students are really afraid to get out there right now. And we should think of this as a reciprocal relationship between the academic freedom of faculty and the academic freedom of students. And we should take in many ways away those things that have made students afraid to get out there and use their voices.
I agree with that entirely, and Ryan and his colleagues, who are friends of mine, have had a lot more success at pushing their university to be brave on this than we have at the University of Chicago. So I very much defer to his views. I just wanted to add the behavior of the administration vis-a-vis the universities as a brilliant example of the screw-ups that the administration makes. I mean, to make these deals and then to come back and say, I mean, that's part of the story of Harvard, right? So there was kind of an agreement in the making, you'll know better than I, and then the crazy letter was sent that said, and we're going to run your place for you. And that's when, Gerber really said, no, we can't do that. Same thing with the compact. I mean, Brown thought they had an agreement with the government, and then they get invited to do something entirely different. So these are bad decision-making, bad negotiating strategies. How can you negotiate with an interlocutor who's going to move the goalposts all the time? Yeah.
Gene?
I'm not a university guy. I pass on this one.
Now that's a short answer. Okay, Susan Shine, an alumnus, asks, how do you envision our democracy being restored to its intended state of being? How long do you think this will take? And she says, what can I do to help this along? And remember, you're being brief. Gene?
Well, I'll take the last part of that question first. I mean, you can, get active. Go out, if you didn't join the 7 million people who went out over the weekend, go out next time. Get active in politics, supporting candidates and issues that you support. As a practical matter, you have to. Will have to happen in steps. You would think one necessary step is to take control of the House of Representatives, or to take control away from the Republican Party, and so work toward that end. And that certainly won't solve everything, but it would be a big deal, actually, because then there would not only be some pushback, there would be some oversight. There's no oversight now. Democrats can't issue subpoenas and call hearings and haul people in, on pain of being jailed. Just get active, and it's gonna take all of us.
Ryan?
Speaking to the last part again, my sense is, and I'm happy to expand on this after we're done, but I don't think that authoritarianism has been normalized in this country yet. And I mean that even among the Republican Party, actually, which some people may disagree with, but my sense is it actually hasn't been. And so that leads me to say a couple things. And one is that it's really important that people that want to resist authoritarianism cast a very broad tent. and they welcome in people from across the political spectrum, especially people that maybe realize they once supported Donald Trump and they no longer do. Welcome them with open arms and say, welcome to our side of these things. And the other thing is that even internally within the Democratic Party, it needs to have a very, very broad tent. From the left to the center right, or wherever how far that goes, it needs to be a broad tent that's just a pro-democracy party in a small d sense. And the way people can do that, as I mentioned earlier, I think being involved, as Gene said, with organizations that are explicitly pro-democracy, not pro-policy, not pro-anything else, but are saying the reason we are here is a principled stand for democracy, and there's a lot of those set up now, and being involved in those is really, really important.
Sue?
So there's I'm sure many people here know Tim Snyder's little book on tyranny. It's a whole collection of very brief, very important, very practical measures that you can take. I recommend you reread it, get it if you haven't, and take a look there. The other thing I would add, I completely agree with what my colleagues have said. Don't freak out. Don't let them get under your skin. So, one of the things that they're trying to do is make you think that there's no way that that they're going to allow the Democrats to win the midterm elections. Now, that's a possibility. I have colleagues who are experts in American politics who are really concerned about that. But it's also the case that if we go into it thinking that's true, then turnout's going to be low and we're going to concede. So, as I said at the beginning, keep acting as though we live in a democracy. Pretend not to notice what they're doing, and exercise those democratic muscles.
My last question, and this is a question that can be answered with just a number, if you so wish. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being deeply pessimistic and 10 being serenely optimistic, how optimistic are you that 20 years from now, these United States of America will still be the same democracy that it is today, with the same 50 states under the same Constitution? Sue. Gene looks like he wants to go first.
Do I? I'm just calibrating here. I'd say I'm an 8 or 9. No, I think we'll have the same Constitution. That qualification there, the same democracy we have today. Okay, I mean, but
the
I think
democracy
structurally,
we have been accustomed to.
I am more optimistic than pessimistic because, like Ryan, I don't believe that there's a pro-authoritarian majority in this country or anything close to that.
Ryan?
I'm on a similar path as Gene on that, actually. And so just to briefly say that, I don't think we're going to be this. I think we'll have the same Constitution. I think we'll have the same 50 states. But that Constitution and the way our democracy works can be reimagined in a lot of different ways. And there's been moments like this in this country before, not as extreme as we are, but we have had populist upswings in this country. I recommend to people that haven't read it, for example, the book by my colleague Bob Putnam that's actually called The Upswing, where he talks about the moment of a lot of things that we came to appreciate in the way our government and society works came from a real nadir around the beginning of the 20th century that had a lot of parallels to what we have now. And we can think of these moments, if we do the right thing, it's not going to happen on its own, but if we do the right thing, can lead to actually a sort of creative rebirth that I think can ultimately make us stronger in the end.
Sue?
So I'm an irritatingly optimistic person by nature, so you may want to take this with a grain of salt. I guess I'm sort of where you guys are. I might say 7. But there are some things that have happened that they're sort of genies that are out of the bottle that are going to be hard to put back in, even under good scenario of the MAGA movement sort of dissipates. We get back to having pro-democratic, whatever political party, leaders in office. The experience around the world is that you don't snap back right away. That kind of what Gene was saying before. It takes a lot of work to reestablish some of the norms that actually are so important, such as truthfulness. I'll end by, revealing my age by saying I remember when Joe Biden ran for president in 1988. He was in the Democratic Party. Some of you guys remember this too. And he had to drop out because it turned out he had plagiarized some speeches by Neil Kinnock in the UK. Now imagine the kind of the standards of honesty and integrity that would mean that you have to drop out of of course, he went on to have a brilliant political career. It wasn't the end of his career. But Norms of honesty of public officials. How do we get back to that? Norms of following rules, norms of having consistent, cogent explanations of actions. I mean, let's look at the set of explanations we've had for why our government is sinking ships and killing people in the Caribbean. See, they're all over the place. They make no sense collectively. So these are things we're going to have to work very hard to repair under the likely scenario that we get people back in leadership positions in government who care about democracy.
Well, I'm about a 4.5, and I'll just leave it there. And it's been a great privilege to moderate this, and I hand it now to John Penn to say our closing remarks.
Thank you. That went really fast, sped by. So on behalf of the Institute, I'd just like to thank you all for coming today. I mean, we're so grateful to have hosted such esteemed guests, this timely and important discussion. So after what we've heard today, I think it's worth reflecting on the words of the writer Susan Sontag, who reminds us that the likelihood of democratic renewal depends in large part on the capacity of citizens to resist lies and disinformation, and that capacity is rooted in critical thinking and real knowledge. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank our guests, Susan Stokes, Ryan Enos, and Eugene Robinson, for sharing your insights and for helping us to better understand the threats facing our democracy and the road ahead. And thank you to Mike Tomasky for the excellent moderation and to those in the audience that submitted such great questions. I'd like to also thank Congressman Ro Khanna and GW President Ellen Granberg for joining us today and carving time out of their busy schedules to prioritize this discussion. And finally, we'd like to thank once again the Knight Foundation for their generous support in making this event possible, and our own Elise Meyer-Connolly for organizing everything you see here today and many things you don't. So this concludes the formal portion of the event, but if you'd like to continue the conversation, we are hosting a reception upstairs. So if you're stressed about the State of the Union, you can use some comfort eating and drinking. We'll be serving hors d'oeuvres and drinks until about 7. And the elevators are through the hall, and we're on the top floor. So thank you once again all for coming today.